The first thing that hit me was the smell-sharp bleach and wet latex paint seeping under my door at 4 a.m. Sour as a hospital corridor. A rasping sound followed. Metal on wood, like a saw gnawing at a hidden knot. When I flicked on the porch light, the beam found a crude red X slashed across my front door. The paint still dripping in fat, glossy tears that pooled on the welcome mat. My grandmother had braided. A notice flapped beneath the X, stapled so hard the wood splintered around each silver tooth. It was a proclamation dressed as stationery, printed with the HOA crest that tried to look like an eagle, but read more like a vulture. The paper's edges curled from the dew, and the ink bled into the fibers, as if the letters themselves couldn't bear the message. Final demand. Lien initiated. Seizure proceedings authorized. Across the street, floodlights washed the clubhouse like a stage set. A golf cart rolled past my yard with a neat whisper, its tires sighing over the asphalt, the logo glinting on the side. The cart carried their pride and their menace clipboards, neon vests, a battery-powered bullhorn, silent for the moment, and a camera pivoting on a little neck like a pigeon waiting for crumbs. In the passenger seat, the board president sat lacquered hair unbothered by the breeze. Her chin lifted with that strange entitlement that smells like expensive candles and stale control. Her eyes skimmed over my house the way a butcher might consider a cut of meat. Weighing, measuring, assigning value per pound. The night hummed with generators from the landscaping shed they had repurposed into a command post. Somewhere, a pressure washer squealed the shrill scream of chemicals, stripping surfaces clean of their past. The sound climbed into my teeth and stayed there. Down the block, the fountain coughed to life. Right on schedule, a timed luxury that spit perfect arcs of water into the sky, even as their notice threatened to take the roof over my head. It essay particular cruelty when a place is so thoroughly planned that even the indignities arrive with precision. The notice read like a sermon of certainty. Fees tallied in columns that marched to a total meant to intimidate. Lines of alleged violations from mailbox height to mulch color to a non-compliant wreath size, as if grief could be itemized by diameter. The bolded section, draped in legalese, someone had downloaded from a template mill and lacquered with announced their favorite phrase, ultimate authority. They wrote it as if it were holy, as if it came carved on stone tablets, as if small crowns could turn ordinary people into gods. The ink, still slightly tacky, smelled like a lie you could bottle. I could taste Coparenger, raw and bright. My bare feet registered the grit of night-damp wood under the porch rail. My fingers felt the paint's sticky skin, warm enough to remember the brush. The camera on the golf cart tilted to follow the movement. A second notice slid into my mailbox with a soft, smug thud, like a glove-dropped-in challenge. Somewhere, a dog barked and then thought better. A single moth skittered against the porch light bulb. Each impact a tiny tap that sounded like seconds passing on a clock I hadn't wound. Have you ever stood before a symbol that was designed to make you small and felt the opposite happen? Have you ever stared at a red X and heard something ancient shift under your feet? I thought about the board's favorite greeting at meetings. I was no longer welcome to attend. The way they purred that phrase ultimate, authority-like, a spell. I thought about the safe in my grandfather's study and the frayed twine around the thick bundle he never let out of his sight. I thought about paper older than the association, older than its bylaws, older than the people who believed clipboards were scepters. They had the paint, the floodlights, the online portal that could spit fines like seeds from a crushed pomegranate. They had the newsletter that dressed threats in a sweater vest and called them reminders. They had the golf cart with the camera that blinked its red eye like a patient predator. But what they didn't. Tina what? Their late-night bravado and their laminated agendas could not anticipate was that my grandfather's signature lived deeper in this ground than any notice they could staple to a door. What they didn't know was that the hand that drew the lines of this neighborhood once belonged to my family, and the hand that wrote the deeds did not tremble even in old age. What? They didn't. Tino was at the papers in our safe could pull the rug from beneath their throne, and reveal it for what it was. A folding chair on a polished floor. And as the paint dried into a scar, the old man's smile quiet creased. Certain rose in my mind like dawn through oak branches. The red X looked less like a warning and more like a mark on a treasure map. Before the HOA had fonts for every mood and a logo for every lecture. Before the clubhouse smelled like lemon cleaner and manufactured cedar. There was land. My grandfather walked it when the air carried sage and dust and the low buzz of grasshoppers like a living wire. He could measure without a ruler and see boundaries the way sailors see weather in a sky that looks blank to everyone else. He kept a surveyor's notebook in his pocket and a square pencil behind his ear. Graphite smudges decorated his fingers the way stories decorate a face. He met my grandmother while staking a creek that only flowed in spring. She brought him a jar of sweet tea, and he drafted a deed on the back of a paper bag because the story of our family always folds back to land and ink. He built this house with calluses, with careful thrifts, with a habit of saving finish, nails and coffee, tins labeled like mysteries. My childhood smelled like sawdust and sun-heated shingles, like engine oil and the citrus you release when you rub a lemon leaf. Under the crawl space, against the foundation. He set a little metal box with a key that lived on his belt loop longer than I'd been alive. He called it the heart. He meant the documents, original plats, meets and bounds, descriptions, easement letters signed by men, now long gone. And most importantly, the master deed and the developer agreement nobody but him seemed to remember existed. I grew up with maps on the walls. I learned to spot the difference between a boundary line and a fence line, between a neighborly handshake and an enforceable clause. My hands learned to flatten creased vellum without tearing it, and to follow a legal description from iron pin to iron pin, as if I were tracing veins. When I left for college, I took the quiet compass of those skills with me. I studied archival science and property records, which smell like dust and vinegar and sometimes like trouble. I returned when my grandmother needed me and stayed because the house and the old man seemed to exhale in relief when I walked back in. The neighborhood grew around us. Developers shook my grandfather's hand and wrote checks. He insisted on clauses they considered quaint. They wanted flexibility. He wanted permanence promises baked into the deed, like stones set in mortar. He made room for a homeowners association because he believed shared spaces need shared care, but he retained what he called a gate nobody could see. When he explained that to me, he didn't use many words, but he looked at the oaks and then at the horizon, and I understood. A key clause, a reversion here, a declarant right there, a condition precedent tucked where only a person who loves land would look. Years piled up like shingles. My grandfather grew lighter and more luminous, and sometimes looked at the house the way lovers look at each other across a crowded room. He smiled at the HOAS early newsletters, amused at the fuss they made over seasonal flags and acceptable wreath materials. He frowned when the tone shifted, when names hardened into titles, when preferences matured into punishments. He told me, without telling me, to keep the keys safe. The home became more than brick and air. It held the first steps of a nephew who now outruns everyone he meets. The slow footsteps of a grandmother descending the stairs in a blue robe that smelled like lavender. It held a Thanksgiving where we burned the rolls and laughed until the cranberry sauce jiggled in outrage. It held the quiet. Devastating afternoon, I returned from the hospital with a bag of medications and a list of what to do when breathing is a job. It held me when the house no longer held them. So when the HOAS tone sharpened to condescension and then to command, when certified letters began to land with a performative thud, when my mailbox became a slot machine that only paid out notices, I felt something ancestral stir. At first, it was petty citations about my porch swing being an inch too wide, a warning about non-conforming mulch. They wrote as if they were saving us from ourselves. They wrote as if memory were a nuisance. I paid a fine or two, because it was easier than arguing with a machine. But machines learn. Mine learned that if you feed it once, it wants a meal plan. The first bold move came on a humid Monday when the air smelled like cut grass and distant chlorine. A board meeting convened with a special agenda item labeled Compliance Escalation. I wasn't notified. A neighbor sent a photo of the screen that projected behind them columns of fines. My address highlighted like a target. A draft motion to authorize foreclosure proceedings to protect community standards. They cheered themselves by voting unanimously. They updated the portal with a new total that looked like a down payment and a countdown that felt like a firing squad. Then they slid the red X across my door before dawn. Not because they had to, but because they liked how it looked. What would you do if a place that holds your family's story was reduced to a ledger entry? Would you feel the same prickle between your shoulder blades that says, "Not yet"? Would you feel your grandfather's key bruise your palm from a pocket where it has always lived? The ink on their motion dried. The mosquitoes win at the edges of daylight. And the safe hour they never arrive as villains. They arrive with tote bags and agendas printed on thick paper that smells like starch and superiority. They arrive in matching polos embroidered with the community crests, the kind of uniform that lets ordinary people pretend they are infantry in a war against porch planters. But once a crown, even a plastic one, graces a head, it rewires the wearer. The next week's unspooled like a film that someone kept rewinding to savor the meanest parts. The smear began with a newsletter that traded information for innuendo. My address morphed into a cautionary tale about habitual non-compliance. A photo of my house cropped to make the porch swing look like an architectural atrocity appeared beside a paragraph about protecting property values from selfish actors. The font was cheerful. The sentence construction was barbed wire. My beagle's evening walk changed. Conversations thinned as we passed. A mother redirected her stroller with the subtlety of a chess move, as if deflection could keep contagion at bay. The fines multiplied like mushrooms after rain. Decorative rock color variants. Unauthorized heirloom rose trellis. Seasonal flag exceeds approved dimensions. Each came with a documentation fee. The label, that smells like opportunism and toner. The portal pinged my phone with notifications at odd hours. A digital drip that soaked in tension and swelled the wood of my patience. I began to print everything. The printer warmed the room with a plastic heat and the paper. As soft rasps stacked into a satisfying column in a manila folder whose weight promised future use. Then came sabotage. My sprinkler line, buried shallow near the hydrangeas. Split overnight with a clean slice, as if a neat hand had guided a box cutter along the PVC. Morning greeted me with a muddy crescent and the smell of wet earth and cheap glue. The HOA posted a reminder about the cost of water waste 3 hours later. The path light at the driveway's edge disappeared, sheared clean at the base. Wires curled like question marks. An anonymous note appeared under a flower pot with the crisp school principal scold of a person who sharpens pencils for pleasure. Unsightly fixtures are discouraged. The handwriting was familiar from signatures on a neighbor whispered that I had been called a bad example in a closed Facebook group. The post included a collage of my alleged sins, the wreath that honored my grandmother's favorite season, the blue shade of my porch ceiling that Southern grandmothers swear keeps wasps and spirits away, the old metal chair whose paint had worn down to the soft green of a lake under cloud cover. The comments chattered like sparrows with a mean streak. The board president liked them all with the efficiency of someone practicing a piano scale. One afternoon, my trash can lids were photographed open by an inch. The uploaded evidence captured an orange peel curled into a comma, a banana string clinging like a rumor. The caption warned of wildlife hazards and assessed a $150 fine. On another day, a tape measure snaked across my front lawn, its yellow tongue flashing between my bushes. As a contractor muttered measurements into a phone, the words blending with the hum of the cicadas, until the distinctions between living noise and bureaucratic bother dissolved. The contractor's vest smelled like gasoline and that door-to-door whispers grew legs. Someone slid, photocopied, know your rules pamphlets under mail slots. Edges jagged from a cheap trimmer, ink smudged where the toner had been stingy. Someone else chalked a passive-aggressive arrow on the sidewalk, pointing to my driveway with the words non-standard finish. The chalk, dusty and pale. The letters dissolving with the first evening. do. My camera caught a pair of teens filming my porch with a phone, while a woman waited in the golf cart, thumbs drumming the wheel. The teens were not villains. They were conscripts. I felt frustration sit down in my chest like an unwelcome guest and set its elbows on the table. It brought friends. Sleeplessness that tastes metallic. The throb behind the eyes that warns of a storm. The hum of adrenaline that makes a coffee cup jitter even when you're holding it steady. At night, I lay awake and heard the neighborhood's mechanical rhythm stir. Fountains timed coughs. The ratcheted creak of a pool gate slow close. The whine of a distant air compressor. I smelled fertilizer and chlorine and someone's overripe trash baking in the sun. I felt the house breathe and underneath, the land hold, patient as bedrock. Have you ever had your daily rituals turned into crimes by people who claim to be defending your way of life? Have you ever read your own routine, described as a threat? My sympathy for myself, for the neighbors who believed the theater grew with every petty cruelty, but sympathy is a poor shield. So I reached for something older than my temper. The manila folder became a box. The box acquired tabs, selective enforcement, harassment, unpermitted acts, financial statements. I began to mark dates with an archivist's care. I traced the board's meeting minutes, posting times, notice errors. I cataloged the smell of paint on my door and the hour it dried. I counted the votes that should have been 2/3 and saw they were barely half. I pressed each page into place and felt the faint give of paper on paper, the sound of a quiet weapon being assembled. Frustration became fuel. And somewhere beneath my feet, an old signature warmed like a sunstone in my pocket. The safe's key has an old weight, a density that modern objects do not bother with. When I turned it, the lock made a soft throat-clearing sound, and the door swung open on hinges my grandfather oiled with a ritual he never missed. The smell that rose was the perfume of truth in storage. Iron, cedar, paper, time. The bundle waited where it always sat, bound in frayed twine. They're not flattened by decades of his thumb. My hands knew how to lift it without cracking the edges. The vellum side when unrolled, the translucent sheets letting ink from one page ghost into the next, like a memory pressing through. There it was, master deed. Not a copy. The deed. Its title font had the arrogance of the 1960s, the ornaments around it pretending to antiquity. But the substance was all grandfather. The meets and bounds sang a song he taught me to hum. From the iron pipe by the live oak, N32E, to the creek bed. Thence, along the thread of water. Thence, to the marked stone at the fence. And below the melody, the counterpoint, the developer agreement, executed with handshakes and notarized with a flourish. Retaining declarant rights to be held by the grantor and heirs unless extinguished by specific recorded instrument. Not extinguished! I traced the clause reserving easements over private roads and common areas, enforceable by the grantor's successor. I traced the right to suspend the association's access to those easements in cases of abuse, bad faith, or violation of the grantor's standards. Grantor's standards. 2 words that might as well have been his portrait. I made copies, certified and sealed, the raised notary stamp leaving a pleasant bruise on the paper. I pulled the HOAS Articles of Incorporation and Bylaws. The smell of toner and smugness followed them out of the printer. Their own pages birthed their undoing. Notice, requirements skipped. Voting, thresholds ignored. Contracts awarded without bids. 2 companies that shared surnames with board members. I flagged them with neat tabs. The colors growing more cheerful as the content grew more damning. I printed minutes where my address was discussed without quorum. I assembled a timeline. Sticky notes marching like soldiers in a just war. Quietly, I gathered allies. The county recorder owes my grandfather 1,000 small courtesies and 1 enormous debt the map corrections he made at his kitchen table. That prevented a subdivision from bisecting a creek? The clerk who took my packet smelled like peppermint tea and diligence. She read until her eyes widened, then made calls. A title researcher friend who can find a needle in a haystack and tell you which field grew the hay. sent me scanned microfilm of the 1980s refinance that reaffirmed declarant rights without quite understanding what it did. A groundskeeper, hand-stained leaf green, told me in a mutter how the board president directed midnight jobs to set examples. He stared at his boots while saying it, but his stare turned into a signed statement when I brought donuts and the promise of anonymity under a whistleblower statute. I wasn't loud. Loudness is the smoke that makes bullies think a fire is coming. It sends them scurrying to host meetings in cul-de-sacs and rewrite narratives on Facebook. I preferred heat. I filed a complaint with the State Consumer Affairs Office for unlawful business practices disguised as association administration. I lodged harassment reports with the county. I hand-delivered a package to the developers, a corporation with a lobby that smells like eucalyptus and money, where a suited manager read the deed clauses and went very still. Associations make developers money until they threaten liability. Then developers become archaeologists of the original paperwork. Neighbors began to notice changes in the era. Hush around the clubhouse. A canceled special session for logistical reasons. A newsletter delayed without explanation. The board president's golf cart traveled more quickly and stopped more abruptly. The camera on its hood twitched like a nervous bird. A local reporter, tipped by a friend who had grown tired of the taste of fear, reached out with a polite email signature that carried the clean scent of fresh ink. I crafted a statement without adjectives and attached documents with footnotes that didn't waver. The newspaper published an article about alleged HOA overreach amid deed dispute, all couched in caution and balanced quotes, but the photos told the story my red X door, the stapled notice, the cut sprinkler line, the old vellum lit by morning sun. My phone buzzed with messages from strangers who had swallowed similar poison under different logos. I felt something swelled that wasn't anger. Hope slipped a chair up to the table and asked for coffee. It tasted like citrus peel and resolve. And then the turning point. The county issued a notice of administrative review into the HOAS practices, and more specifically, into their legal standing to enforce anything while standing on easements they did not control. The developer's successor requested a meeting with all interested parties. The state set a preliminary hearing date. The HOAS treasurer resigned for family reasons. The grounds crew, those reluctant soldiers, began to wave when I passed. Their leaves and rakes smelled like amnesty. Have you ever felt pressure build under a lid and known the pop would be clean? That was the hum in the air that week. Not all neighbors liked me. Some saw me as the woman who threatened to dismantle the machinery that kept their hedges uniform. But machinery is only noble when it serves. Mine had teeth. The papers were ready, tabbed, and toned. The day circled on the calendar like a hawk. They made their boldest move on a Tuesday because tyranny likes weekdays and fluorescent lighting. An emergency executive session convened at the clubhouse with an agenda stamped confidential, a word they used the way a child uses a blanket, to hide and to feel powerful. SUVs lined the curb like an honor guard. The clubhouse door exhaled refrigerated air, synthetic pine scent, and nerves. A rented security guard leaned on a post, the badge on his shirt more costume than authority, fingers busy with a toothpick that he chewed like a metronome. The motion they tried to pass was a Frankenstein of bluster and borrowed law. Immediate foreclosure, authorization, permission to enter my property, to secure assets, and a budget line for emergency compliance measures. The paper crackled with audacity. Meanwhile, at my house, a contractor arrived with a lockbox, a drill, and a work order typed in a confident font. The brand new smell of plastic and injustice riding off the truck. He reached for my doorknob, the brass warm from the sun, and found a sheriff's cruiser idling at the curb. Because at 8 a.m., in a room that smells like copy toner and civic duty, a judge had granted a temporary restraining order based on my documents, giving my family declarant rights, the teeth they always had, and ordering the HOA to halt any enforcement action pending review. The order's language was calm and devastating. The sheriff's deputy, whose uniform smelled like starch and a long day's promise, read it, folded it, and stood on my porch like a hinge. Nothing was moving without creaking past him. At 9 a.m., The county inspector posted a notice on the clubhouse door. Administrative review in progress. Meetings suspended. The tape peeped under the pressure, a satisfying sound like truth finding a crack. Inside, the board president's voice escalated in pitch, and though I had no desire to hear her words, the rhythm of footsteps, hurried heels on laminate, carried through the thin walls. The developer's representative arrived, files tucked under an arm that telegraphed neutrality, and a pen poised to sever ties if necessary. We gathered in a side room decorated in art that lacked conviction. The air conditioner hummed in the key of indifference. I set my box on a table that was too glossy for the weight it now had to bear. Tabs glowed like little flags. The vellum lay under a clear protector that made its age look like an icon behind glass. When the inspector asked for the HOA's permits for the late-night paint, the asphalt, the water cut, they presented a shrug dressed as a binder. When the developer representative asked for proof of quorum and proper notice for votes that had changed lives, they offered minutes with creative math. When the county's attorney asked who authorized entry onto my property without court order, the treasurer's empty chair spoke loud. I didn't have to raise my voice. The documents sang the song my grandfather wrote. Declarant rights retained. Easements over the roads in common areas controlled by grantor's successor. Association authority contingent on acting in harmony with the grantor's standards. Bad faith and abuse triggering the right to suspend access and functions. Selective enforcement. Harassment. Unpermitted. Alterations each page, an instrument, joining the orchestra, until the room vibrated with a verdict. No one had spoken aloud. The state investigator slid financial statements across the table with red marks, noting expenditures to companies whose addresses matched board members' relatives. A separate stack tracked fines levied disproportionately on a handful of owners' widows. Newcomers, the soft-spoken, the board president's posture deflated in slow motion. A sail, losing wind. A reporter sat quietly at the back, the soft click of a pen, the only betrayal of attention. The sheriff's deputy waited outside the door, not menacing, merely present. The gravity in a system that sometimes forgets gravity matters. And then came the county issued an immediate cease and desist on all enforcement actions pending review. The judge's order was read into the record. The developer's representative notified the board that, per the original agreement, failure to act in good faith could result in suspension of their use of easements the roads, the clubhouse, the fountain, the very veins of their power. My letter of suspension, prepared with legal counsel, slid across the table like a blade in a velvet sheath. It revoked board access to common areas for official functions until a third-party supervised election could be held. The tape on the clubhouse door thickened to certainty. Outside, in a small demonstration of sudden humility, a maintenance worker peeled my Red X from the door and scrubbed the crimson ghost. Wet solvent that smelled like oranges and penance. The paint bled onto a rag that justified its existence at last. The contractor with the lockbox left with it unopened. The work order's bold font wilted in the heat. Have you ever felt justice approach like a thunderhead pressure? Dropping, wind changing, smell of ozone, known it was finally your turn to watch the rain. By afternoon, my porch was quiet except for the lazy rattle of wind through oak leaves. Tetley thumped his tail against the planks, satisfied by the return of normal noises. The fountain at the corner fell silent, temporarily cut by the county's order to conserve until permits could be found for whatever pipe gutting the HOA had done last fall. Neighbors stood in little constellations on their lawns, some wary, some relieved, some filing away the day's lesson for future use. In the distance, a golf cart idled without purpose. The storm had not finished, but the lightning had hit the tallest tree. Power rarely exits with grace. It snarls, bargains, over the next weeks. The board president resigned to focus on family, a phrase that tried to perfume a rot it could not disguise. The treasurer filed a notice of financial hardship that the state investigator stapled to a chart labeled self-dealing indicators. The vice president attempted to convene a meeting in a driveway and discovered that easements can be withdrawn from gatherings as easily as they are granted. The clubhouse lights remained off. The fountain's silence became a better sound than its performance had ever been. The state filed charges against 2 board members for falsifying records. The county issued fines against the association for unpermitted work performed under the banner of aesthetic coherence. The developer's successor terminated a maintenance contract and replaced it with a competitive bid that made the numbers behave like numbers again. The security guard returned to his real job and stopped playing at sovereignty. Insurance premiums, once soothed by lies, spiked in the presence of truth. The association's reserves, strained by frivolities, looked suddenly undernourished. And then came the meeting that felt like a waking, held in the high school auditorium because the clubhouse could not host while under suspension. It smelled like floor wax and pencil shavings and 1,000 teenage hopes. Ballots were printed without puffery. Volunteers wore name tags that looked temporary because they were people who had spent the past year peeking from behind curtains, stood at microphones, and spoke into a neutral air. Names were nominated that sounded like the neighborhood at its best. The nurse who knows which kids have allergies. The teacher who leaves chalk on her cuffs like snowfall. The electrician who insists on doing things to code even when no one is looking. The retiree who can coax tomatoes from stubborn soil. They won. The old board members left with their cardboard boxers and their rehearsed faces. We rewrote guidelines with the gentle precision of people who have learned the cost of arrogance. We established an independent appeals panel so no one would be judged by their critics. We capped fines so numbers could no longer be weaponized. We set meeting times when working people could attend. We posted financials online with footnotes for We baked transparency into the bylaws, the way grandmothers baked recipes into muscle memory. We opened conversation like windows. The red X shadow on my door, faint but ineradicable, became a relic. Neighbors brought their kids by two, touched the place where intimidation failed. The kids' fingers left clean smudges that looked like signatures of a future that might behave better than the past. We held a workday where the street smelled like mulch and burgers, where hammers accented the rhythm of jokes, where the only uniforms were sun hats and sunscreen. A bench appeared under the oldest oak, dedicated to the person who taught everyone about land and how to keep promises on paper. My grandfather's name, carved into the slat, required no title. Property values ticked up, but the better metric rose faster. The number of porch lights left on for late walkers, the number of dogs who learned their neighbors' names, the number of fences repaired with borrowed tools and returned with a plate of cookies. The creek, the one my grandparents staked a lifetime ago, ran stronger after a winter of good rain. We planted native grasses rather than new rules. We started a scholarship in my grandfather's honor for students who want to study surveying, archiving, or any craft that binds a community to truth. The fun smelled like fresh paper and possibility. One evening, when the heat had finally loosened its fist, I sat on the porch and watched the sky trade gold for bruised purple. The river stones in my driveway, previously denounced as non-standard, glowed like moons under shallow water. The jasmine breathed a slow sweetness. Tetley twitched in a dream where he was young again, and every squirrel slow. The fountain restarted with a permit and a purpose, and for the first time, its sound fit the place off. Less proud. A background note rather than a sermon. I unlocked the safe and slid the deed back into its nest. The hinge sighed. The cedar whispered. The key warmed in my palm with the temperature of skin alive. Kept ready. Not to wield like a cudgel, but to maintain like a heart. My grandfather's smile visited me once more. Not as a ghost, but as muscled memory the way my hands lay flat, a map, the way my feet know the distance from porch to mailbox without measuring, the way my eyes read a horizon for weather. Authority, real authority, is an act of care that refuses to humiliate. We had learned that the hard way. Now, we would keep it by making sure no one forgot. What would you do if your door wore a red X? Have you ever faced a Karen with a crown, too heavy for the head beneath it? If this story gave you a map or a moment of courage, tell me your HOA nightmare in the comments, and subscribe for more. There are 1,000 neighborhoods and 1,000 little thrones. Sometimes, all it takes to unseat them is a key, a box of paper, and a community willing to remember who they are when nobody is watching.